Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. My name is Anouar Majid. For those who don't know me yet, been many, many years together. But for the first time in all those years, we have hosted events at the Center for Global Humanities. I am now addressing you from Tangier, Morocco. And as you know, the University of New England, we have a campus in this beautiful city, and we're getting ready to host our students in the fall. Assuming that everything will be fine and everyone will all be vaccinated and healthy. And but we have an incredibly special event tonight. We've been planning it for, I think, for more than a year. We tried for 2020, and it was canceled because of the pandemic. And now we rescheduled our speaker, Hugo Mercier, for 2021. And we still have a pandemic. We cannot bring him in person to the state of Maine on our Portland campus and host him properly. But we will do that in the future when the frontiers are reopen and people can fly again and people can get together again and shake hands. So I'm very much looking forward to hosting him in person in the future, and also hosting him in our campus in Morocco, because he knows Morocco very well. He's been traveling. He's acquainted with one of the best universities in the country. So I want to thank, as usual, our great producer, Neil Gendreau, and our great, all-purpose technician and problem solver, Dave Diego, who are working behind the scenes. And I also want to thank you, all of you, attending this lecture, this event tonight, because it is extremely very special. And our speaker tonight is Hugo Mercier, who is the author of a book about gullibility. It's called Not Born Yesterday. He is a cognitive and evolutionary psychologist. Most of his work focuses on reasoning, argumentation, and communication, in particular, how we decide who to trust and what to believe. He is the author with Dan Sperber of The Enigma of Reason. And in fact, interestingly enough, when I first invited Hugo, I invited him on the basis of that book. And soon after that, he published his new book, which is even better for us, which developed a novel and influential theory of human reason. And Mercier is a CNRS researcher in France, which is a very, very prestigious institute, working at the Institut Jean Nicot in Paris, where he had completed his PhD in cognitive science, and which he joined after working in the US at the University of Pennsylvania and Switzerland, University of Neuchâtel. And I'm also delighted to say, for the record, that the president of UNE, James Herbert, is extremely fascinated, interested, and passionate about the topic of reason and rational thinking. And so I'm sure he will be looking forward to this lecture with a tremendous amount of interest. Hugo?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anouar. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody who is listening now. So I will indeed talk to you about some of the ideas I have developed and summarized in the book Not Born Yesterday about gullibility. And I will start by a quote by philosopher Jason Brennan, who has a very kind of dark view of gullibility, and who thinks that people are very easy to persuade, and even if people don't really give them any good reasons. And he wrote that human beings are overly deferential to authority, that they cower before uniform opinion, that they are swayed not so much by reason, but by a desire to belong, by emotional appeal, and by sex appeal. So this is pretty dire. And indeed, it joins in that a long line of scholars and lay people alike who have thought that humans were quite easy to influence. And not only that, but that once you have some hold over someone, and once you can make them accept false beliefs, you can make them commit atrocities, as Voltaire, with some help from his translator, is supposed to have said. Whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. So the view that I will be mostly kind of criticizing in this presentation can be summarized as along these lines. People are quite easy to persuade. They are gullible, even en masse. So even if a lot of people can be persuaded at once, whether through advertising, through propaganda, through political campaigns. And that is because broadly, people are quite unable to judge who to trust and what to believe. And that as a result of this, people accept a whole variety of kind of false, asinine beliefs, and this can have quite dramatic consequences. And so what I will do now is try to show you that all of this is wrong. And I will start by the first point, looking at how easy it is to influence people en masse when you try to engage in mass persuasion, to influence a lot of people at once. I will look at three examples: propaganda in an authoritarian regime, political campaigns in the US, and advertising. So starting with propaganda, I will only look here at the Nazi example because it is, in many ways the most infamous. It is also the one of the best studied, if not the best studied, case of propaganda. Historians, and in particular Ian Kershaw, have done quite a bit of work trying to understand whether Nazi propaganda had any effect, whether it managed to sway the Germans to what the Nazis wanted them to believe. So to do his research, Kershaw looked at diaries, public opinion reports, and various archival material to try to understand whether the German population at large was indeed influenced by this flood of Nazi propaganda. And his conclusion was that Nazi propaganda largely failed, except when it could, and I quote, build on existing consensus, confirm existing values, and bolster existing prejudices. So essentially, either the propaganda was resting on things that the Germans already agreed on, in which case it could, at the limit, at least have some success. But whenever it really tried to change their minds, it mostly encountered failures. And since these kind of, it's nearly 40 years ago now, these early qualitative conclusions by Kershaw have been largely confirmed by a series of quantitative studies, of which I will just give you one example, a really kind of fascinating study by Maya Adena and her colleagues, in which they used the proximity with radio towers to measure the exposure to Nazi propaganda. So a lot of Nazi propaganda, maybe most Nazi propaganda was carried by the radio, which was the dominant medium at the time. And if you lived close to a radio tower, you had better signal, and therefore you were exposed to more Nazi propaganda. And the question is, does this increased exposure to Nazi propaganda lead you in particular to engage in more anti-Semitic acts, such as denouncing Jewish people to the authorities? Well, what these authors found is that indeed, Nazi radio propaganda did have some effect on anti-Semitic acts. However, these effects of increasing anti-Semitic acts were only observed in areas that were already highly anti-Semitic and that had been highly anti-Semitic for centuries, and that it tended to backfire, and so to have the opposite effect of that intended in other areas. So we really find the confirmation of Kershaw's conclusion that if people are already highly anti-Semitic, the propaganda might help kind of unleash these sentiments, but that it doesn't really persuade anybody to become more anti-Semitic. And there is this really kind of revealing quote by Kershaw that he found in the reports made by the Nazis who wanted to figure out what the German people were thinking, this kind of like the equivalent of bullying, if you will, who wrote that our propaganda encounters rejection everywhere among the population because it is regarded as wrong and lying. And we could, multiply the examples, and even if you look at Stalinist Russia or other examples of authoritarian propaganda, the effect seems to have been very limited. Turning now to political campaigns. As you know, political campaigns are a huge deal in the US, and a lot of money is spent every year, and especially every 4 years on political campaigns, whether that takes the form of robocalling, canvassing, distributing flyers, paying for ads on TV or online. And so in order to study whether all of these campaign strategies are effective, political scientists have relied on various methods. And the most reliable of these methods is to run experiments. Essentially, they would do an experiment in which, for instance, they can divide a city, or they can use the fact that a city is divided into electoral districts. So I think that's Philly here. And in half of the electoral districts, they will engage in one campaign strategy, such as canvassing or robocalling or distributing flyers or whatever. Or in the other half, they will do nothing. Or in half of the state's TV markets, they will play some TV ads, and they won't play these ads in the other half. And then, very simply, they look at whether people in these areas that have been affected by the campaign strategy are more likely to vote for whomever the campaign was supporting. And so recently, a couple of years ago, Josh Callan and Dave Brookman, they looked at all this work. And so they did what we call the meta-analysis. So they just looked systematically at all the results that existed in that field. And so they found 40 such field experiments. And they added 9 original field experiments of their own. And on that basis, they concluded that the best estimate of the effect of campaign contact and advertising on Americans' candidates' choices in general elections, so essentially whether all of these campaign effects that had been measured had any effect on all of these campaign acts, had any effect on big elections, like presidential elections, the effect of these things is 0 on average. So very small at best, to put it nicely. And broadly, this work finds that, and work in political science generally, finds that there are no effects of political campaigns in major elections shortly before election day. That we find small effects, like larger but still small effects, on campaigns that have, or on votes that have weaker priors, such as ballot measures or primaries, in which people just can't decide to go for the Republican or the Democrat. We do observe some effect of politicians' opinions on their followers, but only for non-attitudes, so things that people don't really care about. And that most of the influence is bottom-up, such that public opinion quite heavily constrains politicians in what they say and to some extent in what they do. Turning to the next example now, advertising, which really dwarfs by its budget political campaigns. The way the efficacy of advertising, how powerful it is, and how much it persuades people is usually measured is by looking at its elasticity. So let's say you have a brand and they're already running some ads in various formats. And the question is, if you increase the amount of money that is spent on ads, or if you increase how many ads are being run, how much are the sales going to increase? And if the sales, let's say if you double your advertising, if your sales double, then you have an elasticity of 1. If you increase your advertising, but if you double your advertising, but your sales only increase by 50%, then your elasticity is 0.5. And the best review that there is now of the effects of TV advertising is a recent paper by Brad Shapiro and his colleagues, in which they've looked at hundreds of advertising campaigns. And their conclusion is that a sizable percentage of a sizable percentage of statistically insignificant, so really, really so tiny that you can't be sure that they exist, or negative estimates. And to be more precise, on the whole, they find that the average elasticity is 0.01. So on average, they find that if you double your advertising budget, your sales are only going to increase by 1%. So the effect is absolutely tiny. So broadly, the effects of advertising appear to be small or non-existent. And indeed, that's been in a way kind of known for a while. And Gerard Tellis, one of the gurus of advertising research, put it in his book. The truth, as many advertisers will quickly admit, is that persuasion is very tough. So we can see from these 3 examples, and really they could be multiplied, and we could be looking at religions or other domains with the same pattern we could obtain, that mass persuasion, when you try to convince a lot of people at once with some kind of simple messaging, persuades nearly no one. The only messages that have that do manage to spread are those that resonate with people's priors. So things that people would already be inclined to believe. And so things that presumably would have little effect on them. And that it is only when some trust has been earned that some influence is possible at the margin. Why? Why is it so hard to persuade people, especially to persuade a lot of people at once? Well, I think it is because humans possess sophisticated cognitive mechanisms of open vigilance or mechanisms that we've also called mechanisms of epistemic vigilance. So how do these mechanisms work? Well, when we're told or when we read something, the first thing we do is we check the plausibility of the content given our priors, given what we already believe, given what we already know. So for instance, if Joan tells you you should buy this phone, the first thing you will do without even thinking about it is looking at whether that belief is coherent with what you believe. So if she's recommending an iPhone and you hate everything Apple, for instance, then you will think that she's wrong. That is the default reaction. Anything that someone tells us that doesn't fit with our priors, that doesn't fit with our beliefs, our intuition is to think it is false. Fortunately, we have cognitive mechanisms that can allow us to overcome this initial rejection and to accept communicated information, even if it clashes with our beliefs. So even if something that might seem surprising or implausible, under some condition, you will change your mind and accept it. And so, what are the cues that you might look at to decide to accept something you would have initially rejected? Well, you look at whether the source is well informed. So in the example we have, does Joan have personal experience with the phone that she's recommending? Is the source competent? Is Joan someone who knows a lot about smartphones? Does the source have your best interests at heart? Is Jones, a salesperson in an Apple store, or is she just a friend of yours? Are many people agreeing? If all of your friends are recommending the same phone, well, maybe it's a good reason to give it a try. And are there good arguments? Is Joan able to explain to you why this phone is so good? By appealing to its battery life or the quality of its camera or whatnot. And so a lot of experiments and other types of evidence in psychology and other disciplines, and even really kind of common sense, tells us that as adults, we are well able to attend to these cues and to decide who to trust based on how well informed they are, whether we think they're competent or not. What is more remarkable is that now some research over the past 20 years has shown how even very small children are able to take these cues into account in deciding who to believe and in deciding whether to change their minds when someone tells them something. And so what the research has shown is that at least when they are preschoolers, so when they're 4, 5, or 6, children are able to take all of these cues into account in some ways. So for instance, a 5-year-old or even a 2-year-old to some extent is more likely to believe and to act on the basis of what someone who is competent says. Someone who has been repeatedly right in the past will be more persuasive to a very small child than someone who has kept making mistakes. And so we can tell for sure now that these abilities, even though it's a lifelong learning process and we keep kind of fine-tuning them throughout our lives, the basic building blocks of these abilities to evaluate what people tell us are present very, very early on. So when we are in a situation in which we have all of this information, then we do change our minds. So, when you talk to people who you can trust, your family, your friends, when they talk to you about something that they are knowledgeable about, something within their area of expertise, and when you have time to exchange arguments with them, then people do change their minds. They don't, they're not that stubborn, and you can indeed change their minds in the right situation. However, when these cues are absent, so when we don't know really how competent the source is, when we're not sure that they have our best interests at heart, and when we don't have time to exchange arguments with them, then what happens is that we become rationally skeptical. And so in the absence of any good reasons to change our minds, then we just reject the information that is communicated to us. And I think this is why most mass persuasion attempts don't work, is that, when you see an ad, you have no reason to believe that the person making the ad has your best interests at heart or really knows what they're talking about, and you can't exchange arguments with them. And as a result, you go back to your initial reaction, which is to reject most attempts at persuasion. However, clearly enough, I must admit that this is only true as a rule, and that people have, over the centuries and until now, accepted a wide range of false beliefs that does appear to make them look gullible. So the last point I want to look at is it really true that believing these false things that people do believe can really make us commit atrocities? And more generally, how bad is it to accept false belief? Is it really so dramatic and consequential than we often believe to be the case? And I will argue that on the contrary, most false beliefs that are widespread in the culture are held only reflectively. So I would explain what I mean by this right now. And essentially, a belief that is held reflectively is a belief that is held in good faith. So people can really say, I believe in this, and they're not lying, they're not deceiving anybody. And yet that belief does not have the consequences that it should have if it were held in a more kind of intuitive, kind of emotional manner. And so I will just illustrate that. It's a bit abstract. I will illustrate that with an example. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember the Pizzagate conspiracy theory that was extremely kind of popular in 2016, and that to some extent kind of gave rise to the whole kind of QAnon universe. And according to that Pizzagate conspiracy theory, high-level Democrats were abusing small children in the basement of a pizzeria in the suburbs of DC. And if you look at polling at the time, so that it was mostly in 2016 in the Trump versus Clinton political campaign and kind of election year. If you look at polls at the time, it seems as if many Americans, and nearly half of potential Trump voters, agreed that something like Pizzagate was going on, that there had been this whole kind of pedophilia thing ongoing among Democrats. And remarkably, one of these believers in Pizzagate, Edgar Madison Welsh, took his big gun and he stormed the pizzeria. He drove quite a while. He stormed the pizzeria and he demanded that the children be freed. And since obviously there were no children, he was put in jail. But and our contention here is that this person had an intuitive belief that children were being abused. And if you really believe, if you intuitively, emotionally believe that children are being abused, imagine you have seen footage of them being abused, then actually trying to free them is the right thing to do. So as kind of surprising and counterintuitive as it might seem, that guy was coherent. He was acting on the basis of his beliefs. He thought the police was corrupt, and the only thing that he could do to save these poor children from being abused is to do it himself, and that's what he tried to do. And so then again, within his belief system, it is the kind of the moral, the right thing to do. And now contrast that with what was the overwhelming reaction to Pizzagate, which was to do things like leave one-star comments on the pizzeria's website, like this one that read, pizza was incredibly undercooked. Suspicious professionally dressed men by the bar area that looked like regulars kept staring at my son and other kids in the place. Definitely not coming back, beginning to think the conspiracies about this place are true. And so here we have someone who, in our scheme, only has a reflective belief that Pizzagate is true. So he does think there's something going on, but his behavior is completely out of touch with the belief. Like imagine kind of intuitively believing that children are being held there and being abused there, and yet you go to the pizzeria with your children, with your own child. You go there, and then the first thing you do is you leave a one-star review, and the pedophilia is not even the first thing you mention in your review. Like you start by noting that the pizza was undercooked, which seems like a really kind of trivial thing by comparison with the whole pedophilia thing. And so, even though obviously the vast majority of the people who did anything about Pizzagate didn't take that gun and try to free the children, Instead, they only wrote one-star review, or talked to journalists, or they said that they thought it was true, but they didn't really do anything else about it. And that is really incoherent with an intuitive belief that children are being held. And so this is a pattern that we find across many domains. So for instance, conspiracy theories, Pizzagate is an example of that. It is crazy when you think of it, that people are so vocal about their beliefs in conspiracy theories. If you really believe that the NSA was so powerful that it could orchestrate 9/11, then surely they can kill some random person who is accusing them of that. And indeed, you can see that when people really believe there is a conspiracy, or when there is an actual conspiracy, people tend to shut up, and it's really hard to get them to talk. And we see that with the whole efforts that have to be made in order to make whistleblowers actually blow the whistle. And the same phenomenon can be observed for fake news. So fake news are bad. I'm not for fake news, but their effect is much less strong than what many people fear. And in particular, people who accept fake news and tend to already have political attitude that is compatible with the fake news they accept. And the fake news doesn't really have much of an effect. It doesn't really make anything worse. It's just compatible with what they believe, but it doesn't change much. And the other way we can tell that the belief is held reflexively is that the belief is mostly used to justify a behavior. So instead of causing the behavior, we have the behavior, we want to engage in the behavior in the first place, and we only use the belief as a way of explaining and justifying why we engage in that behavior. And so to illustrate that, I will look at the example of bloodletting. So bloodletting is a practice that was popular for centuries and millennia in Europe and in the United States, of cutting someone who is sick, typically at the forearm in Europe and in the US, and letting some blood flow in order, presumably, to restore the balance between the four humors. So the standard theory of bloodletting is that Gallen's humoral theory of disease had proven so popular that people started to bleed their patients. And most notably, maybe when George Washington developed a throat infection in the winter of 1799, he was taken to bed, and the best doctors of the day were brought to his bedside, and they drained him of 2.5 liters of blood, so about half his blood. After which he, completely non-mysteriously died. And so it seems to be a case in which we have a belief there, a belief in the humoral theory of disease that has very serious and costly consequences. However, this is actually not at all how things work. And we know that because with some colleagues, we have looked at who practices bloodletting in the world. And we found something that is known by every anthropologist, is that something like half of the world's culture, or maybe a third of them, have practiced or practice bloodletting in one form or another, even though none of them have ever heard of Gallen or the humoral theory of disease, and many of them don't even have any kind of theory for why they practice bloodletting. And so what seems to be happening is that for various reasons, drawing a bit of blood to cure an ailment is an intuitive practice, and that in some cultures, people develop a reflective belief, a set of kind of complex theories for why that is a good practice. But the beliefs have only very little impact on the practice. It's really the practice is driving the belief rather than the other way around. And we see that as well, just in the medical field, with anti-vax attitudes. So this graph that you probably can see very well shows if you look at the red line on each graph, this is the percentage of people who are kind of strongly anti-vax in many countries, and this is kind of across the years in many countries. And as you can see, in just about every country, there are a few percentage of the population that are strongly anti-vax. It goes from quite a few percent in France to practically nothing in other countries, but they exist essentially everywhere in the world. But what is striking is that the reasons people have, or people say they have, to distrust vaccination are different everywhere in the world. And so what that suggests is that, then again, for a variety of reasons, people do not like vaccination. It's not an intuitive form of therapy. People don't like it as a rule. And then in different places, they will use many different reasons for justifying this intuitive dislike. So to summarize, I have been arguing that we are not gullible, a bit kind of far from it, that instead we are endowed with efficient mechanisms of open vigilance. These mechanisms consider a series of cues and information. Once we have all of that information at hand, then things work out well. We know when to change our minds, and we can accept good information. When we don't really know who we are talking to, when we don't have time to exchange arguments, when we don't have these cues, we come back to a state of kind of rational skepticism when it's really hard to make us change our minds. And I think that this is why, by and large, mass persuasion fails to persuade. It is true, indubitably, that some false beliefs do spread, even though it's rare that they do so through mass persuasion. But these beliefs tend to be reflective, and so they don't really impact much our thoughts and our behavior. It's more the other way around. It's more we want to behave in such and such way, and then we adopt the beliefs that go with it. And that's something that I develop in the book. These reflective beliefs also tend to serve some social ends, such as justifying our behavior. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hugo. What an interesting presentation, an excellent summary of your wonderful book on the subject.
Thank you so much.
We have a number of questions, some from students, and I'm sure our president, James, is going to have a question, or I'm sure he will. But in the meantime, I'm going to start asking you some of these questions just to get going. And I want to ask you one of the questions we got from the students goes something like this. You mentioned that the best way to curb the spread of conspiracy theories is to have a trustworthy government, and that the foundations of an institution affect its public perception. And the foundations of an institution affect its public perception. How do you believe the USA government should foster trustworthiness within communities in the wake of a controversial election and a global pandemic?
Wow. Well, I wish I knew the answer to that one. It's hard. Like, building trust is hard and takes a lot of time, and it's long and complicated. So there isn't going to be, unfortunately, a silver bullet. But you have to look at all of the kind of the institutions and the incentives that make sure, or at least kind of maximize the odds that people in charge are going to behave well, and to make sure that they take the people's interests into account. And so clearly, for instance, in the US now, the backsliding, the democratic backsliding that people are observing, and that is largely led, I must say, by the direction of Republicans in different states. It is going to lead to distrust towards the government. And so, restoring democratic institutions, or stopping them from backsliding would be a great first step.
Okay. So we have another question here. We'll see how it goes. When discussing Pizzagate, you mentioned you don't think the believers hold the conspiracy very close, as evidenced by the fact that only one of their followers actually took action to stop the child abuse. What do you think of the people who were tricked into storming the Capitol building by Donald Trump? They were fed a false narrative with no evidence, the same way Pizzagate followers were, but they took action. Do you think they reflected gullibility?
So that's a good question. So first of all, in the case of Pizzagate is very stark because there's just one person out of supposedly millions who believe that. But even in the case of the Capitol, if you look at polling, something like, I think between 2/3 or 80% of Republicans said that they thought the election was fraudulent. and yet you kind of only had a few thousand people at the Capitol. So it's still a small minority of the people who supposedly believe these conspiracy theories that take action. And as is true for all kind of demagogues and populists, it's not clear which way the influence is going. So was Trump manipulating these people, or were these people using Trump as a conduit, as a vehicle for their own opinion? And I would argue that it is mostly the latter. And kind of the best accounts I've seen of the event suggest that although clearly Trump wanted them by the Capitol, and probably to try to sway the outcome of the vote that was taking place in the House that day, it seems that he didn't plan for them to actually storm the Capitol, and that was something of their own initiative. And more generally, it's not clear, if you because we all believe that the election was fair and that Joe Biden was elected. We tend to think that people who disagree with us must do so because they have been brainwashed by such and such, media and personality. When in fact, if we look at it from their perspective, that we are the ones who have been brainwashed by the mainstream media. So obviously, they're wrong in that description, but we're also wrong in that their baseline belief. Imagine if you're a Trump voter and everybody voted for Trump, and maybe your whole state went for Trump by like a 70-30% margin. It makes sense that you would believe that Trump should be elected, and so you don't have to believe actively the conspiracy theories to question the election. You just have to not believe the mainstream media. So the main issue is one of lack of trust in the mainstream media, rather than trust that would be too strong in alternative media.
So yeah, thank you. I'm going to play a question from James. As I mentioned, he's been following this lecture. Here we go. Just make sure it sounds right.
Bonsoir professeur, je vous remercie beaucoup pour cette discussion très intéressante, surtout qu'il se fait tard à Paris en ce moment. Alors je continue en anglais. You make a really good case about belief change depending upon priors, but this begs the question of the origin of the priors themselves. And it seems to me it boils down a lot to source judgments. Few people deny that they discount competence altogether or expertise, but they're not good at judging who actually has expertise. And that problem is compounded by the internet these days. So my concern with your analysis is that people are not very good at assessing the credibility of sources. And so they tend to believe false claims, not because because they're disconnected from any source, but because the sources themselves are problematic. And it seems to me that itself is a form of gullibility. So for example, if you take false information about Pizzagate or about the President Biden in the US not winning the election, it's not, people were listening to people who they believed to be credible, even though they were not credible. And to me, that seems like a very clear source of, it contradicts this picture of the rational mind that you've painted. I wondered if you could comment on that. Merci bien.
Merci beaucoup. Très bon français. I will switch to English as well, though. So thank you for the question. So I completely agree with you that we're bad at evaluating the competence of people who do things we're not really familiar with. So, it's hard for someone, to know who is the most competent economist, who is the most competent scientist, because we're not close enough to, unless you're, an economist or a scientist yourself and within your specialized field of expertise. But it is hard to tell, in the same way that it's hard for me to tell who is a good mechanic, or it's when the domain of expertise is too far from our own, it becomes really difficult. But I think that the main effect of that is that people discount the opinion of experts and scientists too much. So people are not, as you were saying, they are indeed unable to realize how competent many people are. People don't realize how, if people did, like, if just telling them, well, 97% of scientists believe that climate change is real, that should be enough. Like, that should tell you, okay, well, then it's true. That should be sufficient evidence for anybody who realizes like the amazing amount of knowledge and expertise and information that all of these scientists have acquired. So I completely agree with you that there's a big problem there. Where I would disagree a bit is that I don't think it leads people to accept a lot of false information. And I think that in the kind of cases you are describing, the causality goes the other way around, is that people have very strong priors. And so, for instance, as I was mentioning earlier, if you're a Trump voter and everybody you know is a Trump voter and your state overwhelmingly voted for Trump, it makes sense that you would believe that Trump would, should be elected. Like, everybody, you don't know a single Biden voter, in the same way that in 2016, everybody in the intelligentsia thought that, Clinton would win in a landslide. And so once you have the belief that based on your personal experience that Trump should have been elected, then you will accept beliefs that explain why he hasn't been elected. Beliefs about conspiracies, about fraudulent election, and then you might trust the people who tell you these things, but because they tell you things you agree with. And so the trust doesn't explain why people accept these statements. People accept these statements because of their priors, and then they come to trust the source. So I think that would be my interpretation of what's going on there. But yeah, that's yeah.
So I have another question from one of the students again, and it goes: do you feel that society, especially millennials and Gen Z, are starting to rely more on the use of social media to know the difference between fact and fiction with news? Although you talk about how social media is not always a reliable source platform.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, clearly people are increasingly consuming news on social media. What effect this has is not very well known. So the thing that has been the best studied is whether it affects it, like the use of social media to get news has an effect on polarization. So the fact that in the US in particular, people are people from both parties are growing increasingly to dislike each other. And that doesn't seem to be the case. And one reason we think that, or political scientists think that, is that obviously there has been a rise in social media, just about everywhere in the world. But the rise in polarization is only concentrated in a few countries, like the US, to some extent Canada, and a few others. And so it's unclear. I mean, if social media are playing a role in that, then it must be in conjunction with some other factors. And if I had to bet, the rise of cable news is a much more likely culprit than the rise of social media. So yeah, on the whole, I would say that they don't have a strong positive or negative effect on the quality of information people consume.
I was very intrigued by your mention of Jason Brennan, who gave a lecture at the Center for Global Humanities a few years ago, and you quote him to the effect that he seems to think that people are more interested in a consensus than they're in truth. Or there, and so which led me into thinking that, would you be comfortable saying that people are more interested, they spend more time rationalizing their unexamined beliefs than they do seeking some sort of absolute scientifically valid truth?
Yes, I mean, in most cases, people don't even bother rationalizing anything. They just, carry on with their lives, and we're all weird, academics, and we spend our lives doing that. But not everybody is as obsessed with having true justified beliefs as we are, and rightly enough. But yes, broadly, even within the times people spend reasoning, I would argue that they spend more time trying to justify their beliefs than trying to engage in some kind of enlightened and objective quest for truth. Yeah. But sometimes, as a side note, sometimes even if you're biased in the right context, if you're biased, biased with other people who, who are good conversation partners, who disagree with you, you might still actually get some very good outcome out of that, as long as you're not doing it purely on your own or purely with people who agree with you.
Yeah, there's another question from a student, and I would like to ask it, and let me just get it in front of my screen. Are there certain aspects of culture, religion that make the members more or less gullible?
Well, broadly, no. I mean, obviously there will be some things that will make you more or less likely to accept some specific belief. So, if you grow up, Christian, then if someone tells you that something is based in the Bible, you might be more likely to accept it. But that doesn't make you more gullible more generally, because it might make you less likely to accept something based on some other religion. So it changes your priors, but it doesn't change the way you evaluate information more generally. I mean, the thing that might do that is, to some extent, the scientific education. Like, it's hard to tell whether there are kind of people who are drawn towards that type of thinking, or whether education makes a big difference. But usually with education, people become more what Dina Kuhn calls evaluativists. So they develop this ability to realize that two people might disagree, and that you can weigh the evidence on both sides and try to figure out who is right, without either thinking that one of them has to be absolutely right, or thinking that both of them can be right at the same time, and no one cares. And so that's something that education can help you develop.
Well, with that remark, I think we have reached the perfect conclusion for this wonderful event. Education is key always. Thank you so much, Hugo. I really am so grateful for your commitment to this event and the way you have helped us make it happen despite the time differences.